Hello, I'm Deputy Chief Foster. I'm here to give you an overview of Race Matters for Juvenile Justice and the Racial Equity Institute workshop. In 2010, the CMPD began working with Race Matters for Juvenile Justice. RMJJ is Race Matters for Juvenile Justice. It is a collaborative leadership team formed by the juvenile judges of North Carolina's 26th District. RMJJ brings together legal officials, system experts, service providers, and community members who have set an agenda to reducing disproportionality and disparate outcomes in our juvenile justice system. Several of RMJJ's partners include the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, the District Attorney's Office, Department of Social Services, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools, and many other agencies. Workforce development is one of the 6 dimensions of change that RMJJ uses to achieve its goal. RMJJ, in partnership with the Racial Equity Institute, co-hosts an intense workshop series entitled Racial Equity, also known as Dismantling Racism. The training is designed to build the capacity of educators, health practitioners, law enforcement, other professionals, and community members who are interested in understanding and eliminating racial inequities, disparities, and disproportionality within our society. This training is not about race relations or individual acts by any one person. The focus is on structured, systemic issues that still exist today. Many are ingrained in our everyday life and business, most of which, if it has never impacted us, we've never thought about it. Generally, what doesn't resonate with you oftentimes is due to the fact that you may not have had similar experiences. The data clearly shows there are disparities in all our systems, and our goal is to ensure equal treatment of all people as an agency. It is easy to explain why some numbers are higher than others. That is the easy part to explain. It's the fundamental issues where one child has one opportunity and another one doesn't based on either biases or systemic procedures. Several topics that will be discussed during the workshop are implicit bias, power analysis, the history of race, history of affirmative action, and privilege. Remember, things some people take for granted are not felt by all. Ask yourself, why do I feel this way? And remember, this is not an individual act by you, but it does cause you to step outside yourself for a minute and think of how other people may have felt and still feel to this day. The goal is social awareness, to understand why some areas are developed and designed the way they are, to know why a segment of population's health and education opportunities in a particular area are low. Think of how hard it is for you at that very moment in class, and then think how someone else not like you may feel. We do not expect you to leave the class with a solution or know exactly what to do next, but we do expect for it to enhance your knowledge of structural racism, understanding that this has nothing to do with individual acts of ill will. However, it has everything to do with embedded systemic arrangements within our society. Professor John Powell once said, institutional practices and cultural patterns can perpetuate racial inequities. Next, I would like to introduce Elisa Chinn-Gary, Clerk of Superior Court, and Judge Lou Trosh, Juvenile Judge of North Carolina's 26th District.
Hello, I am Elisa Chinn-Gary. I hold the office of Mecklenburg County Clerk of Superior Court and Judge of Probate. I am one of the founding members of Race Matters for Juvenile Justice, also known as RMJJ. Let me take a moment to tell you about RMJJ. It is a collaborative leadership group formed by our local juvenile judges. It brings together other judicial officers, system experts, service providers, and community partners who have set an agenda to reduce disproportionate representation of and disparate outcomes for children and families of color through institutional organizing and through workplace development. The vision of RMJJ is a Charlotte-Mecklenburg community where the composition and outcomes of juvenile courts cannot be predicted by race and ethnicity. Our mission? To build a collaboration of community partners who will bring their constituents to the table and partner in the court's efforts to reduce disproportionality and disparities. What do we mean by disproportionality and disparity? Disproportionality is when a given population is over or underrepresented in a specific population category. Disparity refers to an unfair difference. It is the opposite of parity or equality, and it can extend to many different segments. For example, when men and women are paid differently for doing the same job, or Black students and white students receive different punishments for the same infraction. Judge Trosh and I approached former Chief Rodney Monroe, who headed the North Carolina Disproportionate Minority Contact Advisory Committee at the time, and we asked Chief Monroe to send some representatives to our meeting and learn about RMJJ and our work around implicit bias. Judge Trosh will speak about implicit bias in detail. It simply refers to the often subconscious mental shortcuts that we naturally make when we categorize people and places and things. While implicit biases are often automatic, they are malleable and can be retrained by overriding or replacing existing stereotypical associations. Implicit bias results when decisions are made every day impacting race, ethnicity, gender, and social class disparities. Chief Monroe was very well informed about the research surrounding implicit bias. He brought the entire department on board as an RMJJ community member. Your police department is to be commended for its significant investment of time and resources to develop its officers' professional awareness and competence regarding disproportionality. CMPD has helped fund racial equity training for department personnel as well as partner agencies. RMJJ selected the Racial Equity Institute, headquartered in Greensboro, North Carolina, to provide a standardized curriculum for our ongoing workforce development strategy and to advance our mission and promote our vision. The curriculum is folded into an intense two-day workshop that puts bias and racism in a historical context. The workshop is entitled Dismantling Racism, and you, more than likely, have been invited to experience this learning opportunity. In the United States, people of color, particularly Black Americans, have significantly worse outcomes than white Americans on every indicator of well-being and justice. If race is a driving force in determining outcomes, it is crucial that we understand how race and racism have been constructed in our country and the ways in which it lives in our social structures and our institutions. That is the only way we can adequately address these inequities. Dismantling racism also provides employees and leaders with a common language, understanding, and framework to discuss these very difficult issues. The ultimate goal is to reduce individual bias, eliminate structural racism, and reconstruct a more equitable and accountable system of justice. To date, more than 375 CMPD personnel have attended the Dismantling Racism training. And that includes first-line supervisors, school resource officers, police academy staff, patrol training officers, police recruits, police cadets, and amazingly, over 90% of the command staff. Yes, CMPD has demonstrated its commitment. There are well over 2,000 people in the department, so we still have a long way to go. Yet this is but one of many strategic components, and we can already see the positive impact this training is making. You may say, I'm not bigoted or prejudiced. I don't discriminate, so I don't need this training. Or, I'm a minority, so of course I'm not biased toward persons of color. Even the term bias-based policing often brings to mind officers who intentionally or deliberately act upon preconceived stereotypes and prejudice. That is not what we're talking about here at all. Research tells us that implicit biases largely exist outside of one's awareness. In other words, most of us are unaware of our biases and tend to act on them unconsciously. Nonetheless, these subconscious attitudes are both pervasive and powerful. Why is this training necessary? Because bias can influence real-world professional judgments, decisions, and actions that have life-altering impact. The stakes are high. We owe it to those we serve to develop systems and professionals within those systems that are working to achieve optimal performance. CMPD has been at the forefront of this work with RMJJ because both Chief Monroe and Chief Putney understand that in order for CMPD to meet its goal of serving everyone in our community equitably, fairly, and effectively, all department personnel must be aware of biases that could prevent them from performing at their best. We believe the Dismantling Racism Workshop offers a perspective for recognizing and addressing these issues. One thing I particularly hope you take away from this video is that law enforcement is not being singled out or targeted here. System leaders and employees from CMS, the District Attorney's Office, the Department of Social Services, Council for Children's Rights, the U.S. Attorney's Office, Mecklenburg Ministries, and a host of other organizations have eagerly participated in this training. Service providers, government agencies, and nonprofits alike are tackling the very complex question of why significant and undeniable patterns of disproportionality and disparity exist. The Dismantling Racism Workshop is offered to employees of all our community partners because recognizing, confronting, and reducing patterns of implicit bias is critical. To date, more than 1,600 employees have undergone this training. That's because all of us, regardless of our race, ethnicity, gender, social status, or sexual orientation, carry subconscious thoughts and feelings into our respective careers and jobs. While the workshop provides a comprehensive race analysis, its primary purpose is to foster cross-agency rapport, trust, and a common understanding, and provide the tools we desperately need to serve everyone with equity and fairness. I ask you to set aside anything you've heard from friends or coworkers, positive or negative, and approach the workshop with an open mind. Remember, there is no right or wrong way to feel about this information. You are entitled to your own experience, your own reactions, your own emotions. Also, remember that you, your department, and everyone in our community will benefit from a Charlotte-Mecklenburg where outcomes of well-being and justice cannot be predicted by race. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Judge Lou Trosh. I'm a district court judge here in Mecklenburg County, and I'm here today to share some information with you about implicit bias and how it impacts all of us and all of the work that we do. I want to start by telling you a really troubling story that led me to this work. About 7 years ago, I had a set of first appearance hearings one afternoon. It was a Monday afternoon in juvenile court. The first case that I had involved two young men charged with an armed robbery. And as I'm sure you know, as police officers, with a serious offense, any felony offense, either in adult court or in juvenile court, the defendant has a right to know, to a first appearance, to know what they're charged with, what their rights are, to meet with their attorney, and then to talk about their detention status. In juvenile court, we have a separate detention hearing. We don't have bail or bond. And so we were going to conduct that this day as well. At any rate, when I called the first case in, it was one of the co-defendants for the armed robbery, a whole host of people came in from the lobby. Family, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, aunts, uncles, neighbors came in. In fact, a pastor from a church also came in to testify on behalf of this young man's character. That's unusual in juvenile court. Unfortunately, many of the cases that I hear, I don't see all of the support that was apparent in this case. So I was pleased to see all of the people in court. The young man also then entered the courtroom. He entered the courtroom, however, from another door. I call it sometimes door number 2, but it is the holding cell. As armed robberies are about as serious offense as we get in juvenile court, I expected that he was going to come in from detention, so it wasn't a surprise. They removed the shackles from his ankles, and he sat down with his counsel. I proceeded to let him know what his charges were, what his rights were, and then we got into the detention portion of the hearing to determine whether he should be released or not. I heard from his family that he lived in a 2-parent household in an upper middle class neighborhood in a suburb of Charlotte. He attended a Charlotte-Mecklenburg school, an upper middle class, frankly, school in one of our suburbs, and he had never been in trouble with the law before. In fact, he had never been suspended from school. He was an average student. He was very active in his church. As I said, he had an incredible amount of community support. In fact, the family brought in a stack of letters from family, friends, neighbors, teachers about the character of this young man. I heard all of this, and I let the family know, based on what you're saying, it's very likely that he could be released on what we call alternatives to detention, which may involve an electronic monitor on his ankle, as well as increased supervision by his court counselor. But I had to check out all the information that they were providing, and so I set the hearing for the next hearing for Thursday afternoon at 1:30. I expected that he would be released on a monitor that Thursday, but because it was an armed robbery, I didn't feel comfortable letting him out on Monday. All of the participants in court were in agreement. The court counselor, the case manager, the district attorney, and the defense attorney were all in agreement to come back to court on Thursday to see whether he should be released. The hearing concluded, I then called the second case in. That happened to be his co-defendant, because this young man was charged with committing an armed robbery with another young man. Again, a whole host of people came in from the lobby: parents, aunts, uncles, grandma, grandpa. In fact, a coach from the school came because this young man was active in sports at his school. The young man didn't come in, and he didn't come in. And everyone was milling around finding seats in the courtroom. And I was very busy that day, so I finally turned to the bailiff and said, "Mr. Bailiff, could you please bring in the other young man from detention?" The bailiff looked at me and said, "Judge, there's nobody else back here." And I said, "No, I'm sure there is someone in the holding cell. This is the co-defendant from the armed robbery." The bailiff said, "Judge, I'm telling you, there's nobody else back here." About that time, a young man who I had considered probably was the brother of the juvenile was making his way with his defense counsel to the defense table. In fact, he had come in with his family. I again heard about this young man, that he lived in the same suburb, in fact, one street over from the first co-defendant, that he had no risk factors that I was aware of, no drug activity, no gang activity, had never been in trouble in school. This also was out of character for this young man. I heard from all of the witnesses. They also had a stack of those letters that told me the same thing. I asked now for recommendations from all of the participants. So I turned first to the court counselor, the probation officer, and said, "What are your recommendations?" They said, "Judge, we would like this young man to remain on house arrest at home, go to school every day, stay away from his co-defendant, not go back to the scene of the crime." A list of standard conditions was recommended. I then turned to the case manager. They agreed. "Judge, that makes sense to us." I turned to the district attorney and said, what do you say about this?" The district attorney responded, "We're fine with this also. This makes sense to us, Judge." Finally, the defense attorney agreed as well. At this point, I stopped and I asked some questions. "Well, the other young man that you just recommended stay in detention another 4 days, was he the gunman?" I learned at this point that no, both of the young men had pistols. I said, "Okay, was the other young man the one that came up with the idea?" "No, Judge. In fact, they were spending the night at one of the young men's homes, at one of the boys' homes, and they had watched Ocean's 11. If you remember Ocean's 11, it's the movie where there is a casino heist. There being no casinos in Charlotte, these two young men got the bright idea that they would rob their local McDonald's. They both came up with the idea together. They both put on Scream masks. If you remember the movie Scream, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And they went to the McDonald's, and they together committed the crime. I asked more questions and more questions about what was different about these two young men. The recommendations were for one to stay in detention and one to be released, to remain released. I got no differences, save one. The fact that as you watch this video, you know exactly what the difference between those two young men was, tells both of us everything we need to know about why we're doing this video today, why disparities and disproportionality continue to impact all of our work, and why together we need to do something about it. The fact that you know that the young man in detention was black, and the young man, his best friend since he was 7 years old, who lived one street over, was white, says everything about why I was so troubled that day. The most interesting thing, though, to me, or the most troubling thing, I guess, to me that day was not that these two young men were treated differently. That bothered me. But what really bothered me was that nobody seemed to notice that they were being treated so differently. That one was going to stay in detention, and if he got out, he was going to have an electronic monitor on his ankle, while the other one would never go to detention at all. The first thing I did is what Americans always do, what we're taught to do. I looked for the person that was racist in the room. Who was looking to treat these young men in such different ways on purpose? And as I looked around the room, I realized I worked with the DA every day. I realized that I had representatives in court that were black, white, men, women, and I worked with all of them, including the officer that had made the arrest. I knew him. And I knew from my experience with them that none of them wanted to treat black and white children differently. And yet they had. And I was extremely troubled when I then thought about, how many times have I done the same thing without realizing it? So not only did we treat these young men very differently, but we didn't even realize why. And that led me on a journey to learn about what else is going on that might lead to such different treatment for two young men. Thanks a lot for taking the time to hear me out today, to hear what I had to say. I think that if you continue with this training, it'll both be educational and informative, and I think you'll enjoy it as well. So good luck to you, and enjoy the rest of your training.